This being the last lecture, I want to go back to some of the issues from earlier in the course and take a look at how things we've learnt more recently might bear on those. In the first part of the course, we were all about the role of emotion and intuition, the two major themes in moral psychology and research in moral psychology. And we asked this rather awful question: does emotion influence moral judgment or merely motivate morally relevant action? Now, think about this question as it seems to offer us this sort of real choice. We have to say yes or no. Well, what did we see? We approached this question partly by thinking about whether manipulating participants' feelings influence their moral judgments. And importantly, the idea here was that you were influencing the participants' feelings at the time they made the judgment. So we were expecting this synchronic link between the feeling and the judgment. And it's a very striking finding, I think, that there is actually evidence for a positive answer to this question. And overall, it seems that the evidence is quite compelling. But we should also note that the effects of feelings on judgments are probably quite small. So the evidence is hard to dismiss altogether, but at the same time, it can't be what fully explains the judgment. Now that matters because we asked a related question earlier on in the course. We said, what do adult humans compute that enables their moral intuitions to track moral attributes, such as wrongness? And in answer to that question, we considered as a candidate answer Sinner Armstrong and colleagues' hypothesis about what they called the effect heuristic, according to which if thinking about an act makes you feel bad, then you can judge that it's morally wrong. Now, we saw that the evidence in favour of this hypothesis, I think, is not strong enough for us to accept it, and the arguments are not compelling. But we're also now in a position, I think, to offer an objection and face up to it. The objection is that the effects of feeling on moral judgment are small, whereas if people were really relying on the hypothesis, we would expect large effect sizes, I take it. And as an aside, I think there's a striking contrast between evidence for the role of emotion in moral judgment, which is relatively weak, compared to an abundance of evidence for the role of emotion in judgments of risk, which is reviewed, for example, in this paper by Slovich and colleagues, which is in the references in the notes on this section. So it's quite important, I think, to recognise that although you can change what people are judging by influencing their feelings, in some cases, you wouldn't expect to have a large effect on their judgment. So the idea that the effect hypothesis, the effect heuristic, is the whole story, that's kind of tricky to swallow. Now though, since we looked at that, we've been looking at a dual process theory of moral cognition. So it's interesting then to go back and think to ourselves, well, how else could emotion influence moral judgment? The nice thing about the effect heuristic is it gives us a clear pathway. The idea is that you feel the emotion and then you reflect on what you feel and then you make the judgment. So there's a very clear pathway. But there might be other ways in which emotion can influence moral judgment. And to see that, I want to return to a parallel with physical cognition. So if you saw this bit of lecture 7, the contrast between physical cognition and ethical cognition, you will know that a significant proportion of people judge that a projectile exiting a spiral tube will continue on in a spiral motion. Now there's a cool question here, which is, well, why would you think that? And it can't be because they've observed it, because you would never see this. It's physically impossible. So it's not something that you could observe. So it can't be that observation provides the basis for this judgment. It must be that they have some kind of, beliefs or expectations about the way particles move. And the story that I offered you there, I think this is quite a good story, although of course the evidence isn't overwhelming. Right? I think there is some evidence for it, but it's not overwhelming, is this: fast processes make it appear to you that things move in spiral trajectories. Well, what could that mean? Let me go slowly. We're asking the question whether the fast process could influence the slow judgment. We kind of know that it must do, because there's nothing else that it could explain that pattern of judgments. But that isn't to say that we get a synchronous influence. So none of this theory rests on the idea that at the point when you make the judgment about the spiral, there's some fast process in you which is responsible for that judgment. Right? You're not giving the judgment under time pressure or cognitive load or anything. What's the idea? Instead, it's this: the fast process gives rise to representational momentum. The representational momentum gives rise to experience. It alters the overall phenomenal character of your experience, creating in you, when you observe these things, the illusion that the motion might well be spiral. You, of course, are free to do some thinking about your experience, and you've got lots of experiences of this happening because as you live your lives, you're seeing things move around all the time. So on the basis of your experience of the physical world, you do some thinking, and then in the course of that thinking, you may come to form some beliefs about various physical principles. Now, those beliefs might be things that you can't articulate at all. You'd have a terrible job formulating, or if you're a scientist working in the Aristotelian tradition, you may spend your life sort of writing those principles down. But the important thing here is that you're going from reflecting on your experience to writing down principles, and most likely those principles are what dominate the explicit judgment. So the suggestion is this: people who make a judgment about the spiral trajectory do so on the basis of beliefs that they have formed, not on the basis of any kind of perceptual experience or fast process directly. But importantly, the source of those beliefs is the way that the fast processes are shaping your experience, together with your own powers to kind of reason about it, your concerns with, consistency, simplicity, and the rest, your willingness to make guesses and so on. So here the idea is this: we do have fast processes influencing slow judgments, but they are not doing that synchronously. It's not the fast process at the time of judgment that matters. It's the history of fast processes shaping your experiences, giving rise to these beliefs that you have in the principles, perhaps unutterable, inarticulable beliefs and principles that give rise to explicit judgments. So here I think is a nice view. The fast processes provide the phenomenal material for the slow judgment. So fast processes are absolutely fundamental to understanding a non-expert's conception of the physical world. It's essentially shaped by the way that their fast processes operate, with some but very limited input from reasoning. But the fast processes, as I say, are not having an effect on the judgment at the time it occurs. Now you might say, well, Steve, all right, that's a nice story about physical cognition. You're welcome. But how is this relevant to moral judgment and emotion? And here I just want to suggest, well, look, we can imagine that there is a parallel. And indeed, the dual process theory invites us to draw a parallel. So let's go back to the effect heuristic. So the hypothesis is that you arrive at moral judgments by thinking about how an act will make you feel. And if it does make you feel bad, then you judge that the act is wrong. If this is right, then we would expect that emotion would influence judgment at the time the judgment is made. So our prediction would be that manipulating emotion will influence judgment. But if we take the dual process theory, then what we might expect is something a little bit different. A different route by which the emotion can influence the judgment. So we would expect the fast process to give rise to various kind of feelings and emotions, for example, disgust, but not only disgust, there could also be feelings of happiness and contentment or well-being, or dismay could cause some stress and so on. We would expect people to think about their feelings and think about how various actions and situations make them feel. We would expect that thought process to lead, perhaps in a way that they couldn't articulate at all, to belief in some principles. Or it may be that, as in the case of the Aristotelian ethicists, the deontologists and the virtue theories and the rest, they might write down some principles. And those principles are the things that are most likely to give rise to the explicit judgments. So on this view, we're thinking that the fast processes provide the emotional material for the slow judgment. That really is the fundamental, the ultimate source of those slow judgments, the way that the fast processes work, filtered through reason. We're not expecting, of course, the beliefs to map onto exactly the way that the fast processes work. The parallel with physics is helpful here again. So people don't know a lot about how their fast processes work, and the effects that the fast processes have in experience are quite noisy. So there may well be some failure of overlap, some discrepancies between the principles underpinning the fast processes and the principles that people arrive at by reflecting on their experience. The two things are not supposed to overlap perfectly necessarily. Same thing in the linguistic case, same thing in the ethical case. But we would expect, although the overlap isn't perfect, that for non-experts, the fast processes are providing the basic material for those judgments, both the physical and the emotional case. And that leads us to a different prediction. We're not justified in predicting that influencing emotions will have an effect on judgments made at the time the emotion is influenced. We're rather thinking that should be a long-term effect of emotions on judgment. So the sort of prediction that we'll be inclined to make includes this one. Moral violations will evoke emotions, for example, disgust. This is, for us, as dual process theorists, a much more important prediction. So where are we in conclusion? You may not accept the dual process theory. Of course you may not, in which case you're going to have a different view about this matter. What I want to suggest is that when we bring back the dual process theory to the old debate about whether emotions influence morally relevant judgments or merely motivate actions, we can see a different route via which emotions may more indirectly influence judgments. And this is relevant to a puzzle that we encountered way back in, I think, the second week of this course. The puzzle was why feelings of disgust should influence moral emotions. What I want to suggest is that the hypothesis about the effect heuristic, that does give us one potential answer to this puzzle, but that seems to be false. A more compelling answer is this. On the dual process theory, there are both fast and slow processes which may each influence moral judgments and moral actions. There is no kind of intrinsic connection between those two things. There's nothing to stop the two processes from giving conflicting answers. And indeed, that is a good thing, because the way your mind is built, it's allowed that you can explore and discover all kinds of things through a process of thinking. But at the end of the day, the fast processes are organised around survival, and they won't be thrown off by any mistakes that you make in your slow thinking. So having fast and slow processes separate and serving different situations is actually quite helpful. Nevertheless, you don't want the two things to be entirely separate. And for this reason, you create a situation where the fast process gives rise to feelings, emotions, shapes the overall character of your perceptual experience and so on. And in this way, via the effects on emotion phenomenology, the fast process can indirectly influence the slow process. Because of that bridge, affection, experience, phenomenology, that exists in order to connect fast and slow processes, at least in part. Because of that bridge, we are entirely in the habit of, to some degree, being guided by our feelings in making ethical judgments. So people who are particularly sensitive to their feelings, who have high body consciousness, are also likely sometimes to be influenced in a small way by their moral emotions. The more important puzzle that we can answer with the dual process theory is actually the opposite question. Why do we feel disgust in response to moral transgressions? That's in order that the slow processes can exploit the way that the fast processes operate without being tightly bound to them. Those feelings of disgust are the indirect connections that allow the fast and the slow processes to converge to some extent. Not mandatory that they converge, but it's possible, and it's made possible via the feelings. That's why we have feelings of disgust or pleasure or displeasure in the face of morally relevant actions. There's another puzzle that we have encountered though, which is about reason. And this puzzle, as you know, involves the idea that moral judgments, sorry, it says moral intuitions here, there we're thinking of unreflective moral judgments. So unreflective moral judgments are sometimes, we know this from moral disengagement, but not always, we know this from moral dumbfounding, a consequence of reasoning from known principles. Why is that? Why is it that these judgments sometimes result from reasoning, but not always? Why do these two things have a role? And of course, the dual process theory is just made to answer that question. The dual process theory is just made to answer that question. We tend to associate reasoning with the slow process, and the fast process tends to be associated with things that you wouldn't normally describe as reasoning, although the everyday notion of reasoning is actually a little bit nebulous, and so it could well be that it doesn't map on perfectly to this. But what you can see is that when we have the dual process theory with the fast and slow processes, every judgment will be a consequence of both fast and slow processes, of course it will, but sometimes those fast ones will dominate and sometimes those slow ones will dominate, and sometimes what will happen is the fast ones will not dominate the judgment itself but give rise to an emotion, and that emotion, reflection on the emotion, will be what overall determines the judgment. That might be what's happening in some cases of moral dumbfounding, for example. So we can understand, given the dual process theory, why it is that reasoning is important, even though not every moral intuition will be a consequence of reasoning. My suggestion then is when we go back and we look at the role of emotions and the role of reason, if we accept the dual process theory, not mandatory, if we do accept the dual process theory, then it allows us to resolve both of these puzzles.